Okay, so moving on to Pesach. On Erev Pesach after Mincha, we recite the order of the Pesach offering, which we say many of the details of the halachas of the process of bringing the Korban Pesach. And it's interesting that we always know in the Shalom Farms of Hasena, we say every day in davening, that by reciting the psukim related to those sacrifices, that's how we accomplish the union of Korbanos nowadays. And that's why we say every day the psukim of different Korbanos, etc. But specifically with the Korban Pesach, we find the custom to not just say the psukim of the Korban Pesach, in fact, to not say the psukim at all. We don't say the psukim of the Korban Pesach, but we recount in great detail the procedure of bringing the Korban Pesach. And there is an emphasis, which if you look at the very end, at the bottom of page 408, it says, this is a very brief description of, this is a translation of the Alter Rebbe's words in the Seder, which is based on the words of the Shalah, that says that this is a very brief description of the order of the Korban Pesach. The God-fearing person should recite it in its proper time, so that its recital should be regarded in the place of its offering. One should be concerned about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and plead before Hashem, the creator of the universe, that he rebuild it speedily in our days. Amen. There's a sikha from the Rebbe in the Kutei Sichos, volume 32, where he talks and he analyzes these few lines and points to some details about them. But we're also very careful that it should be in its proper time. It says explicitly in its proper time, more so than we are with other Korbanos. Other Korbanos doesn't necessarily say how it has to be in the proper time. It has to be during the daytime. It doesn't have to be, for example, after you say, if you have to bring a Korban Toida, you say the psukim of the Korban Toida, of the Thanksgiving offering. It doesn't say that you have to say it after you brought you said the psukim for the day, morning offering, and day, much more generic. Here we're specific that it should be the right time. And in many years, it's somewhat of it's something to really pay attention to, because Erev Pesach, everybody's running around last minute, finishing up everything. And usually, let's say even on a regular Friday night over here, Mincha is called for 10 minutes after candle lighting. Even if we have a minyan on time, by the time Mincha is finished, we're screeching into Shkia, into sunset. And certainly if we start a few minutes late, then it's, but on Erev Pesach, you have to be finished with Mincha with enough time. It takes at least a few minutes to say this. And it says that you should say it, with Kavanah. So you have to be finished with Mincha a few minutes before Shkia. One second. But this year Erev Pesach is on Shabbos. So because Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, there's basically nothing you can do in preparation for the Seder all day. So whatever you've done before Shabbos. Anything you haven't done, you have to wait until Shabbos is over. And so this year it's going to be hopefully very easily accomplishable to finish Mincha before Shkia and to say the Korban Pesach, with enough time to finish it before Shkia, right? This is on Shabbos Erev Pesach, yes. Okay. So let's start. The custom so we're just going to read through it and I'll point out some things as we go along. The custom to say the Korban Pesach is first mentioned by the author of Seder Hayoim, who was he lived about 450 years ago, and the various Siddurim of the Arizal bring it. There are some different opinions and even a little bit of polemics perhaps about some of the details of the exact text. And of course, we say it the way the Alter Rebbe printed it in the Siddur, and we'll go through it. So, the Passover offering is brought from yearling male lambs or goats. This is based on the pasuk in Parshas Boy, Shmos Kapitel Yud Beis, where it says, chapter 12, verse 5. This is talking about the Pesach in the year of the Exodus. It says, that says Samim Zachar Ben Shana Yiyalochem. You must have a perfect unblemished male lamb in its first year. Ben Shana. Now, in our sort of colloquialisms, we would say Ben Shana, somebody who's a year old, an animal that's a year old. But in the Torah, which all the karbanos in the Torah have a certain age that they have to be, and here you see it says Zachar Ben Shana. The English translates it as yearling. I don't know what yearling means, but Ben Shana does not mean a year old. It means within the first year. So from when the animal is born, there's actually an independent mitzvah that you cannot bring an animal as a korban within the first 8 days of its life. So the Korban Pesach was a male, and then it says you can take either sheep or goats. So it was a male sheep or a male goat, somewhere between the age of 8 days and 12 months. It's interesting to note that in Parshas Re'eh, that's in Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 2, which is also the reading, it's the reading of the last day of Yom Tov, the last day of Pesach, the second day of Shavuos, Shmini Atzeres. That's the Torah reading for those days. And over there it says, V'zavachto Pesach la'Hashem Elokecha tzoyin avakar. You should slaughter the Pesach to Hashem from the tzoyin. Tzoyin is a collective term for sheep and goats. Well, what's the word for that in English? Is there a collective? Sheep and goats are cousins. Is there a collective term for both of them in English? Sorry? No.
It's a scientific word.
Okay. But in Hebrew, tzoyin, the word tzoyin can mean sheep and goats. Or any lambs, kids, anything of that family is called tzoyin. And then it says tzoyin bakar. Bakar is in Yiddish we translate bakar as rinder, cattle, means cows. Yeah, bakar is cows. So it seems to be saying that you can bring a korban pesach from the cows, but actually Chazal tell us that that's not what it means. And Rashi brings it right here in the pasuk in this pasuk here, and like we said, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 2, that you have to read it as if there were an additional comma there. You have to bring a korban pesach from the tzoyin, from the sheep and the goats. Bakar, and then also if there was a mitzvah for the korban pesach to be eaten al hasoiva, for the korban pesach to be eaten when you are full, not when you are full and you're stuffed and you can't eat anymore, but not when you're hungry, because we want to eat the korban pesach l'shem mitzvah for the sake of the mitzvah, not because you're hungry. So before, if you had few people sharing one korban pesach, then so you just had the korban pesach, that was enough. By the time you ate a few pieces, by the time you get to the end and you eat your kazayas, l'shem mitzvah, you're already full. But if you only had many people sharing one animal, each person's only getting a small piece, so then you would bring a korban chagiga and a korban shlomim, another sacrifice, which you would eat beforehand, and then afterwards you would have a piece of the korban pesach al hasover. By the way, this is also the case with the afikoman. We have the afikoman at the end of the meal, or the end of the Seder. You have to be careful when you eat the Seder, when you eat Shulchan Aruch, not to stuff yourself full, right? To leave room that you're not forcing yourself to eat. That you don't when it comes to afikoman, not that you're hungry, you're not going to be hungry anymore, but that you still have room to eat it, comfortably. So that's what this word of bakar alludes to. That if you wanted to bring a korban chagiga, the korban chagiga could have been from bakar. It didn't have to be sheep or goat. It could have been also a cow. Okay. It's interesting to note what was more commonly brought. Did people more commonly bring goats or more commonly bring sheep or lambs? Lambs or goats? What's the difference between a lamb and a sheep? Any scientists out there?
It's a baby sheep.
Okay, so it's within the first year. I guess it's called the thing. Okay, so what did people more commonly bring? Now, there's a difference in which parts of the animal are brought onto Mizbech. We actually had just this past week, in Thursday of Parshas Tetzaveh, Rashi mentioned this, that there are certain animals which the aliyah, the tail, is brought on the Mizbech, and there are certain animals which it's not. So sheep and cows had the tails brought on the Mizbech, goats did not. So there's actually a story that with Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, the Gemara in Pesachim says that there was a certain goy, a Gentile, who bragged to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira that I go every year to the Beis Hamikdash, to Yerushalayim, and I partake in the Korban Pesach, and they don't realize that I'm a goy, and I'm obviously violating the mitzvah in the Torah that says by somebody who's even a Jew, who's uncircumcised, may not partake in the Korban Pesach. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira did a spiel, and he told him, do you think they give you the best? They don't give you the best part of the animal. Apparently, the tail is a very fatty, choicest part of the animal. We, the Ashkenazim nowadays, don't eat the back half of the animal, so we wouldn't know. But apparently, it's a very fatty, choicest part of the animal. So he told Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira told this guy, go and tell them to give you the aliyah, tell them to give you the tail. So indeed, he did so. And they were like, hey, why is he asking for that? They smelled something fishy. And he said, what do you mean? Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira told me to ask. And so they realized that he was trying to allude something to them, and they found out that he was a guy, and they deaded him. They killed him, and there's some discussion as to why he was liable to the death penalty. But either way, so the question is, how did Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira know that he was going to be a lamb? Maybe it was going to be a goat, and if it would be a goat, then they would have indeed given him part of the tail. So Tosfos over there says that that it was more common practice to bring lambs, than it was to bring goats, and therefore he took his chances. It was most likely that was going to be the case. And the Rabbi explains that the reason why people tried to bring if possible, a lamb more than a goat was because it was an opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Kol Chelav Hashem, to give the choicest part of the animal to Hashem. Right? If you brought that opportunity to bring the aliyah, to bring the tail on the mizbeach as part of the korban, was an opportunity that you only had if you chose to bring a lamb rather than a goat, and so the norm was for people to do that. Okay. Then it says, and slaughtered anywhere in the temple court, only after midday on the 14th of Nisan, after slaughtering the daily afternoon offering, and after the afternoon cleaning of the cups of the menorah. So the Beis Hamikdash was comprised of different sections. The Azara, the courtyard, is the section where the Mizbeach was. And as we know from the Mishnah of Ezel Mukayma, which is on page 22 of your Seder. So we talk every day, there's the Holy of Holy offerings that have to be slaughtered specifically in the northern section of the courtyard. And then there's Kodshim Kalim, that you could slaughter them at any place in the Azara. So the Korban Pesach is the lower degree of sanctity, and therefore may be slaughtered anywhere in the temple court. Only after midday of the 14th of Nisan, after the slaughtering of the daily afternoon offering, which is an exception to the rule. The rule is, and again, we say this every day in davening, at the end of Rabbi, I have Masada at the very bottom of page 21, where it says, that the daily afternoon offering was with this, all the offerings were completed. So with the exception of once a year, the Korban Pesach, there were never any offerings brought in the temple after the Korban Tamid, the afternoon daily offering. But the Korban Pesach had to be brought after the afternoon offering. And obviously after midday. And he says, after the cleaning of the cups of the menorah, which is in accordance with the opinion of the Rambam, obviously in the Beis Hamikdash, they lit the menorah every day. The story of Hanukkah was that they had to light the menorah, so there was no oil. And to commemorate that, we light the menorah on Hanukkah. But in the Beis Hamikdash, part of the service was, I think we just read this yesterday, the very end of Parashas Tetzaveh. So the mitzvah was to light the menorah every day. However, most of the Rishonim hold that the way they did it was that every morning they would prepare the menorah, that means clean it out from the wicks and the oils of the previous day, and set it up for the new one. and then in the afternoon they would light the menorah. The Rambam holds that they would actually do the whole process of cleaning up and setting it up with new wicks and new oil and lighting the menorah twice a day. So when we say here that it was brought after the cleaning of the cups of the menorah in the afternoon, that is in accordance with the opinion of the Rambam that the menorah was lit twice a day, because according to the other opinions, there was no afternoon cleansing of the menorah. It was cleansed in the morning and lit in the afternoon. Okay. We don't say this here, but it was also, the Korban Pesach was also brought after the bringing of the Ketores, what we call the frankincense. Okay, one should not slaughter the Passover offering while chametz is in his possession. Now the truth is that this is already the afternoon of Erev Pesach. In the afternoon of Erev Pesach, regardless of whether or not you're slaughtering a Korban Pesach, you may no longer own chametz. We have to get rid of all our chametz. And on the biblical level, by midday on Erev Pesach, midrabanan, we add a couple of hours to that. But here there is an additional transgression. So if somebody then brought the Korban Pesach before getting rid of all his chametz, so in addition to the general transgression of owning chametz on Erev Pesach, which is only in the afternoon, which is only a positive commandment, tashbisu, right? On Pesach, there's a negative commandment not to own chametz. It says, lo yirah lecha chametz. There's a negative commandment, thou shalt not have chametz. On Erev Pesach, there's no negative commandment to not own chametz. There's a positive commandment to tashbisu. So to destroy or get rid of any chametz from your possession. But that's just on a regular Erev Pesach in the afternoon. But if a person is shachting the Korban Pesach and he did not get rid of chametz, so then in addition to the above, he has also transgressed the mitzvah of the sishchat al chametz tamzuchi, not to shech the Korban Pesach while you own chametz.
On the Seder, there's a bone. Is that the actual Korban Pesach, or is that a symbol of the Korban?
No, it's only a symbol. We're very strict to not refer to it as the Korban Pesach. And in fact, the Chabad custom is that we remove as much meat as possible. You remove from the bone, because it shouldn't be in any way come across as if we have a Korban Pesach, because it's absolutely forbidden to have a Korban Pesach. A few weeks ago, we discussed about whether you could have a Korban Pesach nowadays, but that would only be in the temple. Certainly outside of the temple here in Chicago, it would be forbidden to have a Korban Pesach. Just as you mentioned it, even though you're allowed to cook on Yom Tif, the bone for the Seder plate which you roast the chicken on has to be done before Yom Tif, not only so that you could start the Seder right away, but also because you're only allowed to cook on Yom Tif food that you're going to eat. And because our custom is that we don't eat any of the meat from the bone, it has to be done before. Okay, what happens if he slaughtered it before the daily afternoon offering? It is acceptable provided that someone stir the blood of the Korban Pesach so that it will not congeal until the blood of the daily afternoon offering is sprinkled, and then the blood of the Passover offering is sprinkled once toward the base of the altar. Okay, so if you did it the wrong way around, for whatever reason you slaughtered the Korban Pesach before the afternoon offering, so b'di'evet, post facto, it's valid. And he says, provided somebody else is stirring the blood. However, the truth is that that's also not ma'akev. It would be easy to read this as saying that as long as the blood is sprinkled on the altar after the afternoon offering, it's fine. But actually, that's not the case. Even if b'di'evet, this blood of the Korban Pesach was sprinkled before the blood of the daily afternoon offering, it would be valid. The part that's the ikuva, the part that's indispensable to the thing is that somebody has to stir it until it is thrown, because once the blood has congealed and you can no longer administer the blood to the mizbeach, so then it's a lost case. There's some question as to whether or not you could if you cook it or add, if there's a way to sort of uncongeal it, whether that would be good or not. Okay. Now it's interesting. It says here sheyehi acher memaris bedam, which means that someone else should stir the blood. And I see that in the English they don't say someone else; it just says that someone stir the blood. And the truth is that it's unclear. Why should it be someone else? Who cares who it is? It could be the same person who shechted it. It could be somebody else. What's the difference who it is? And indeed, Rabbi Dain Raskin from London, who has a very thick sefer on the Alter Rebbe Siddur, where he goes into a lot of details, he brings that in the very early versions of the Alter Rebbe Siddur, indeed, it had the word not acher, but that resh was changed with a letter that looks very similar to resh, with the daled, sheyeh echad memaris bedam, that someone should stir the blood. So it's interesting that in this siddur, the English translates it as someone, but in the Hebrew they left the acher, which means someone else. Okay. Then you throw the mizbeach keneged zrika achas keneged hayisoid. So some korbanos, let me say again, you're familiar with this from the morning prayers. Some korbanos are administered 4 times to the mizbeach. Some are administered 2 times. Shtaim shein arba. Shtaim shein arba means that you you have the cup and you throw it onto the mizbeach on 2 diagonal corners. Now, when you throw it in the corner, if you throw it on a corner, it's going to go to both directions. So if you throw it in the northeast corner, it's going to go some blood on the north side, some blood on the east side, and then you go the opposite, and you go in the southwest, and so you've got all 4 sides. The Korban Pesach only had 1 administering. We say this also every morning. In the last Mishnah of Ezel Mekayman, Zrika Achas Keneged Yisoid, it has 1 administering to Mizbeach Keneged HaYisoid. Now, the Yisoid of the Mizbeach means like this, that the Mizbeach was sort of designed like a box. It protruded a bit, went down, protruded a bit, went down. At the very bottom of the Mizbeach, there was a base, a like we have on the bottom of the wall, we have that very thin, what's it called? Baseboard. Yeah, it was a very fat. The amma was a 1.5 feet wide. I think it was an amma about 5 to 5 tefachim, so it was a little bit less than a 1.5 feet wide. That surrounded the whole mizbeach. However, that was in the first temple. In the second temple, the mizbeach was a little bit expanded. But once the mizbeach was expanded to 32 ammas wide, that's just a little bit more than 45 feet by 45 feet, just to give you an idea. I mean, the mizbeach was huge, yeah. So the problem was that the mizbeach had to be entirely in the section of, I forget now already, if it had to be entirely in the section of Binyamin or entirely in the section of Yehuda. Binyamin was Ze'ev Yitraf. I believe, if I'm saying this correctly, it had to be entirely in the section of Yehuda. And the section of Yehuda, the territory of Yehuda, the territory of Binyamin, met right over there. So they had to take off a little portion of the Yisoid HaMizbeach, of that bottom, what you call, I guess the Yisoid means foundation of the Mizbeach, so that it should remain in the entirety in the territory of Yehuda. So it turned out that only 2 out of 4 sides of the Mizbeach had a Yisoid, and the other 2 had no Yisoid. So it was like an L shape around one corner of the Mizbeach, and then it protruded. Which sides was it? Here we go. So this, right, the north and western sides of the Mizbeach had a Yisoid, and the east and southern side did not, but it would protrude 1 amma from the west and 1 amma from the north. And there's 2 opinions as to, when we say it protruded from the west, did it actually sort of bend around and get an amma on the south side, and it protruded from the north and cover an amma of the east side, or did it just protrude straight out and the east and south side remained entirely with no Yisoid at all? Be that as it may, what we're saying over here is that the blood of the Korban Pesach is sprinkled only once, but it must be toward the base of the altar. So it could be anywhere along the western or northern walls of the Mizbeach was fine, but you could not do it on the southern or eastern walls of the Mizbeach. How is it done? Oh, interesting. By the way, another thing that the Rabbi says that the blood is zerika, is thrown. There's actually different opinions about this, whether the blood was thrown or poured onto the mizbeach. Some korbanos had to be with zrika, some had to be with shvicha. There's some discussion as to what the Korban Pesach was. Some machlokes rishonim. Although some suggest over here that sometimes the word zrika is specific, thrown versus poured, and sometimes the zrika could mean just a generic administered to the mizbeach. So it's not necessarily conclusive.
Isn't it sprinkled on?
No, the what was the blood that was sprinkled with the finger, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, that was the Korban Chatos was done with the finger, but most of them were not. Okay. Then it says the sheichet slaughters it, and the first kohen at the head of the line receives it. Now the shechita, the slaughtering of the korban, does not need to be done with does not need to be done by a kohen. Anybody, even a non-kohen, can shecht, can slaughter the animal, but it's mishchita ve'elach mitzvah kohuna after the slaughtering, which there's basically 4 integral parts of the process of the korban. I mean, there's more than 4. Yeah, it doesn't include taking the parts up to the mizbeach, but there's shechita, halacha, shechita, kabbalah, halacha, zrika. Shechita means to slaughter it. Kabbalah means to take the cup and receive within the cup that first gush of blood that comes after you slaughter an animal. If you've ever seen it or watched it on YouTube, it's quite a powerful flow of blood. And then you have halacha, to walk with it to the mizbeach, and zrika is to administer the blood to the mizbeach. So
The
this
animal's still alive when you cut?
no, according to halacha, as soon as you have severed the kana and the veshet, the esophagus and the what's it called? Yeah, the windpipe and the food pipe, then the animal is considered dead, even though it still has those last throws where it throws itself around. It's still considered dead.
Okay.
So the last 3, right? Kabbalah, receiving the blood, taking it to mizbeach, and throwing it. Those all had to be done by a kohen, but the actual slaughtering could have been done by anyone. So that the sheichet slaughters it. Sheichet is neutral, could be anyone, and the first kohen at the head of the line receives it and hands it over to his colleague. Now, what this means is that usually the Korban Pesach is thousands of people coming. Obviously, not everybody goes into the Beis HaMikdash, but even if each group only had one person in the Beis HaMikdash, it's still a very full house. So the way they did it on Pesach was that instead of you having one kohen taking the blood and walking to mizbeach, they had these sort of the lines where they had literally 2 lines of kohenim going, where they would take the pitcher of the blood and pass it up and down, and that was whether it was to save space or the Gemara. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. The Gemara says it was Berev Am Hadras Malach in order to give the opportunity to many kohenim and many people to partake in the mitzvah. Okay, and the Gemara says that part of the integral part of the mitzvah was to, with your feet, with the kohen's feet, to walk to the mizbeach to bring the blood. So even though they had the whole line passing up and down the blood, the last kohen who was the closest to mizbeach took the pitcher, walked a step or 2 close to the mizbeach to fulfill that concept of hilacha, walking, sprinkled the blood, and passed it back. So the first kohen at the head of the line receives it and hands it over to his colleague, and the kohen nearest the altar sprinkles it once towards the base of the altar. He returns the empty vessel to his colleague, receiving the full vessel, and then returning the empty one. So first, ein mavir ala mitzvahs, the Gemara says, when you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, you have to do that first. So first, you take the full one from the kohen to your side, and then you pass back the empty one. First, every kohen is simultaneously doing 2 moves, taking a new full cup and giving back an empty one, but they would do taking it first. There were rows of silver vessels and rows of golden vessels. So the Gemara says that was just l'shem beauty. In order for it to beautify the process, there would be separate lines. for silver and separate lines for gold, and they didn't mix. There were rows of siddur, and the vessels did not have flat bottoms, lest they set them down and the blood become congealed. It's always fascinated with me, this sort of obsession with the congealed blood. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I would imagine that it would take a long time for a cup of fresh blood to congeal. But I don't know. Anyway. First of all, the blood is warm when it comes out of the animal. It would probably have to cool down before it could even think of congealing. And if you have a cup full of it, I mean, that's going to take a long time.
Probably congeals from the top like Jello.
Right, but even if a little bit of it congeals, what's the problem? As long as you have some of it left to sprinkle, it should be good. Anyway, afterwards they hung the Passover offerings, flayed it completely, tore it open, cleansed its bowels until the wastes were removed, and the parts of on the altar were taken out. So they had special hooks on the walls of the altar. They had these beams, these small little, vertical beams with ribuim, whatever hooks, on which they would hang the animal in order to take off the skin. I'm assuming that flayed means to take off the skin. And there's a machlokes in the Rishonim, but the Alter Rebbe rules in accordance with the Rambam that they would flay it completely. They would take off all of the skin before the neck section. Some Rishonim say they would take off part of the skin only until the chest, from the head down to the chest, to be able to take out the internal organs, bring them onto the Mizbeach, and then afterwards finish the flaying. But the Alter Rebbe says they were flayed completely. This is in accordance with the Rambam. Tore it open, cleansed its bowels, until the wastes were removed and the parts offered on the altar were taken out, namely the fat that is on the entrails, the lobe of the liver, the two kidneys with the fat on them, and the tail up to the backbone. Again, sort of just assuming that you're bringing, it doesn't even mention that if it was a goat, you wouldn't bring the tail. So for some reason, he's just assuming this, which would fit with what we said before, that according based on the Tosfos, that it was the norm to bring a kaveh, so the tail was thing. I don't know what the lobe of the liver or the entrails are. I'm not all that familiar with the anatomy of animals, or of humans. So yeah, okay. They were placed in a ritual vessel, salted and burned by the Kohen upon the altar. Why were they salted? Everything that went into the Mizbeach had to be salted. They used to have salt on the ramp going up to the altar. Everything had to be salted. Each one individually, right? So this was a special mitzvah, even though it was a very busy day and there were hundreds of korbanos being brought. It was a special mitzvah that each korban be separately, distinctively brought on the altar. So you can't do like, okay, guys, let's get all the intestines from these 10 animals and bring them up. No, one at a time. Okay. The Gemara tells us a story about the Bnei B'Seira, the famous story about Bnei B'Seira. We mentioned this a few weeks ago when we spoke about Rashi Minatam's Tefillin, where one time Pesach, as it does this year, falls on Erev Shabbos, and they didn't know if they are allowed to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. Sorry, what did I say? Erev Pesach fell on Shabbos. So until Hillel HaZaken came and he demonstrated that you can bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, and of course the obvious question is like, what do you mean? How could it be that nobody remembered that you bring the Pesach on Shabbos? Anyway, but be that as it may, we say what we're about to say here is that only the integral parts of the korban were allowed to be done on Shabbos. So he says like this: the slaughtering, the sprinkling of its blood, the cleansing of its bowels, the burning of its fat override the Shabbos. But the other things pertaining to it do not override the Shabbos. So that's like this year, right? So for example, roasting it to eat at the Seder, you wait till after Shabbos. And then before you start the Seder, that's when you bring the korban pesach. That's when you roast it. By the way, there's some Chassidim. There's a chumrah say that the matzah that you use by the Seder should be matzah that was baked on Erev Pesach. Here in Chicago, it's a difficult thing to accomplish, but Certainly by the Rabbeim, that was something that the Rebbe and the Rabbeim did. Not our Rebbe, but the earlier Rabbeim, actually, they themselves participated in the process of baking the matzahs on Erev Pesach. So what are you doing this year when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos? So what most people do is that they make the matzahs on Friday, so that you do the best you can. But there are some chassidim, I think square chassidim, who go and bake matzahs on Pesach. That means on Ma'ariv, after Ma'ariv, and this year will be Matzah Shabbos, yeah, instead of going home for the Seder, they first go to the matzah bakery and bake fresh matzahs, and which is somewhat challenging to make matzahs on Yom Tov. There's many rules that have to be followed, but that's what they do, and then they use those things, okay? Likewise, if the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbos, the Passover offering are not carried home, right? So what do you do? I was going to say soon that there are three groups. The Korban Pesach is divided into three groups. Now, the reason why it's divided into three groups is as follows. The Pasuk says, also in the same Parshas Boyin, Exodus chapter 12, that it will be slaughtered by the community and the congregation of Israel. So each of these three words, community, Kahal, Adas Yisrael, translate them accurately in English, but those three words, so each of them mean a group. Now the question is, does it mean a group comprised of three groups? So we know a group is 10, a minyan is 10, so that means the group would have to be 30 people, or does it mean three separate groups? So because of that uncertainty, we do both. That means we have three groups, and each group contains at least 30 people. I mean, obviously, there was usually much more than that, although the Rebbe does say that the third group was the Atzlanim, was the lazy people who didn't get their act together. The stragglers, they were in the last group. So when Mashiach comes, if we determine, if Eliyahu Navi determines for us this doubt as to what the pasuk actually means, so then maybe we'll abolish if it means, possibly there won't be any third group anymore. There'll just be two groups. Anyway, so we're going to say that there's three groups. So if it falls on Shabbos, you can't go home. You have to stay in the Beis HaMikdash with your korban. Why can't you go home? It's not a problem to carry in Yerushalayim. There are different opinions. Some say it is a problem to carry in Yerushalayim. Some say you don't go home because then there's the concern that you might start roasting it, to do other preparations for it. Okay, so what does everybody do with a korban? So he says, the first group remains with the korban Passover offerings on the Temple Mount. So they're going out of the Azara. They're in the Azara, in the courtyard. They go out from the Azara through the Eretz Nashim onto the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount was a very big thing. It's 750 feet by 750 feet, so there's plenty of room over there for people to be. The second of the group sits in the Chayil, which is an area just outside the temple court, and the third stands in its place. So they remain literally standing, because you're not allowed to sit in the Azara. They literally remain standing there until Shabbos went out, and they then they would take the Korban Pesach home. There's also some discussion as to why they had to stay there. Why couldn't they go out into the Ezra Nashim, into the outer courtyard, the women's courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash? But be that as it may, that's what they did. When it becomes dark, they go to their places and roast the Passover offerings. Okay, this is all about when it falls on Shabbos. If it falls on the weekday, as soon as they finish, they go home and think. Passover offering was sorted in three groups. So even though we already assumed that you knew that a few lines ago, now we're introducing the concept. Each group consisting of no less than 30 men, like I described before. The first group entered, the temple court was filled, and they closed its doors. Now, there's actually a machlokas in the Gemara if they closed the doors or there was a miraculous thing that the door was closed, because how did they manage to close the doors in such a full thing? But anyway, the Alter Rebbe says that they closed the doors. Why did their doors have to be closed? Why couldn't they stay open? So this Rashi says the reason is because we don't want everybody to come into the first and second group and not have enough people left for the third group. The Ben Hananel says that it was a safety measure. They didn't want people to be trampled to death, as it indeed happened once. So they closed the doors. While they were slaughtering it and offering its part on the altar, they recited the Hallel. Who's the they who recited the Hallel? So over here, they add in brackets the Levium. This is something which there's a very big chiddush of the Rebbe on, because the normative understanding of the sugya of the Gemara is that it's a machloikus. Rashi says that every group reads the Hallel, and Tosfos says no, not every group reads the Hallel. The Levium recite the Hallel. But the Rebbe in his Haggadah and in an ensuing correspondence with Shlomo Yosef Zevin, who we've mentioned many times, was a great Talmud Chacham. We spoke about him in the class about bringing Korban Pesach nowadays, and his correspondence with the Rebbe about that, about Pesach Sheni. Anyway, so he says so the Rebbe in the Haggadah over here writes the Levium sang Hallel. So Shlomo Yosef Zevin, what do you mean the Levium sang Hallel? It's machlokas. Rashi says that the group themselves said the Hallel, the people themselves said the Hallel, and Tosfos says no, it was the Levium. But the Rebbe insisted that it doesn't mean that when Rashi says that the groups, every group sang Hallel, he doesn't mean to say that it was the members of the group themselves. He means to say that every group did it, not just the first group, as you could have misunderstood. And similarly, when Tosfos says what was assumed to have been disagreeing with Rashi, Tosfos is quoting Rashi saying, it wasn't the groups, it was the Levium. So the Rabbi said Tosfos is not disagreeing with Rashi, he's explaining Rashi. He's saying, don't think that Rashi means that the Yisraelim, that the groups themselves did it, it was the Levium. And indeed, in the Tosfos Arash, which I don't know if it was published yet at the time that this Rebbe's correspondence with Rav Zevin, the Tosfos Arash is also another manuscript of Tosfos, so it's the same time as Tosfos, and over there it's clear that Tosfos does not mean to argue with Rashi. Okay, so Reb Reuven, Reb Chani, you're not a lady. We're boring, but Reuven and Chani, you got to sharpen your Hallel singing skills. Now, what do you do if they finished Hallel before all the sacrifice? All of them were sacrificed, they repeated it, and if they finished it the second time, and they were recited the third time. The Gemara says they never finished it the third time. And indeed, those who bake the matzah on Erev Pesach, so again, it's there to resemble the Korban Pesach. So they say Hallel while they're baking the matzah on Erev Pesach, they recite Hallel. Each time Hallel was recited, the Kohanim sounded 3 blasts of the trumpet, Tekiah, Teruah, and Tekiah. Now the English here says of the trumpet, which is true, it was a trumpet, it wasn't a shofar, but it's interesting that they put that into the English even without brackets, because it doesn't say that in the Hebrew, it just says they blew 3 blasts. And this is based on the pasuk in Parshas Beha'aloscha, Numbers chapter 10, verses 8 to 10. Which also has the song of Yom Simcha. What did I say? Chapter 10. Yeah, Aaron's descendants, the preacher, to blow trumpets, an eternal law for all time. And then that's verse 8 and verse 10. On the days of your rejoicing, your festivals, your newborn, you should blow the trumpets when bringing your communal burnt offerings, your peace sacrifices, right? So part of the procedure of bringing korbanos was to have the Kohanim blast trumpets, and we're told that they blew a Tekiah and a Teruah and a Tekiah, but not on a shofar and a trumpet. It's actually a bit of a different art, because a trumpet you blow from the front of your mouth. So to do a Teruah, it's the tongue, it's a bit of a different art. If you've ever blown those shofars that are, the long curly shofars, where also it's certainly much easier to blow from the center of your mouth than from the side, even though the halacha is that ideally you should blow from the side. But anyway, okay. When the offering was entered, they opened the doors of the temple court. The first group went out, and the second entered, and they closed the doors of the temple court. When they finished, they opened the doors, and the second group went out, and the third entered. The procedure of each group was the same. Now, he doesn't mention that the Rambam and the Mishnah only talk about closing of the doors after the first group, But here in the Seder Korban Pesach, he adds in this closing of the doors after the second group, but he doesn't talk about closing the doors after the third group. And it could be, based, we said before, that there's two reasons to close the doors: either so that people shouldn't get too squished, or because we want enough people to be left for the later group. So according to both of those reasons, it may not have been necessary to close the doors after the third group because there was no later group to leave people to. And as it was, there weren't so many people in the third group, so there was no concern of people getting injured. After they had all left, they washed the temple court, even of Shabbos, of the filth of the blood. How was the washing done? A water duct passed through the temple court and had an exit from the court. When they wished to wash the floor, they shut the exit, and the stream overflowed its sides until the water rose and flooded the floor all around it, and all the blood and the dirt of the court were gathered into it. And then they opened the plug, they opened the exit, and everything flowed out, and the floor was completely clean. This is the honor of the temple. So even though usually it would be forbidden to do such a thing on Shabbos, but there's a rule in Shvus Bamikdash that rabbinic decrees, things which the rabbis decreed not to be done on Shabbos, don't apply in the temple. So even though you're not allowed to wash your floors on Shabbos, because that could lead to sweeping the floor, and sweeping the floor is forbidden because you could be mashva gumish, you could flatten out holes. Now nowadays, when we live in places where virtually all homes are rutzuf, that means that there's tiles or wood, there's no holes, it's not earth, so then it's not a problem. But in the times of the Mishnah, it was forbidden to sweep on Shabbos, and so that also related to that, forbidden to wash the floor on Shabbos. What happened to all the kohanim? How did they, if they overflowed the water with the azara with water, did everybody get soaking wet? And in addition, there's another question that it says that the kohanim's clothes had to be clean. So that was certainly very challenging. How do you keep your clothes clean in such a thing? And perhaps they had to constantly be changing their clothes. I don't know, but it does bring, I think, in the Gemara that it's tabois, that there were stages or platforms, step-ups to go in the azara where they could stand. Obviously, they had to be, wasn't just like a box, it had to be part of the floor, because you have to be standing on the floor of the temple when you're doing the service. But whatever, that must have been part of the challenge. Okay. If the Passover offering was found to be unfit, so you shachted everything, and then treifa, unfit means it's treifa, you find a hole in the lung, it wasn't glatt, yeah? So then it wasn't kosher. So then you did not fulfill the obligation until he brings another one. And like the Rambam says, you have to keep him from bringing another one until it's found to be kosher, or until they're all coming not kosher, then eventually once the time is over, once it's sunset, then your time is over, and you're honest, circumstances beyond your control, and you would try again a month later on Pesach Sheni. And in the Sikha that I mentioned before, from Chelik Lamed Beis in Likutei Sichos, the Rebbe discusses at great length the kind of oddity in this being the last line over here. Like, we've already finished the whole thing, you've gone home, you've washed the Azara. Oh, and by the way, and of course, as you can imagine, there's many details of the laws of the Korban Pesach which we don't mention. This is just a basic overview, and why the mention of just this one random law that if the Pesach was unfit, you have to bring another one. And very briefly, the gist of the Rebbe's explanation is more on a homiletical side, that basically there's kind of this sort of dichotomy here. On the one hand, like we said, you read it in its proper time, and its recital should be regarded in the place of the actual offering. So this is not just reading psukim like we do every day, but this is like actually like we're reading the Korban Pesach. But at the end of the day, it's not actually bringing the Korban Pesach. It's not actually in the temple. And this sort of sad note that we finish off with reminds us that this is not the actual real deal. And the Rebbe explains about the idea of treifa, this type of non-kosherness, what it alludes to in the pasuk, in the Torah, which says that treifa is not kosher. It talks about treifa basada, because any hole in the lungs or in the internal organs is no good. But the way the Torah describes that is, if the animal was attacked out there in the field by another animal, that would be a common way of them having internal wounds. Nowadays, they just get it because they swallow needles. But back in the day, where we had healthy, organic, grass-fed cows. By the way, why does so much of the kosher shechita happen in South America of beef? because it's healthier conditions. There's much in America, in many places in Europe, in America, where they shecht cows, only 1 out of every 10 cows is going to be kosher, or certainly only glatt kosher, because there's always problems with the lungs, right? But that wasn't the case that's in the commercial world. That's the reality we deal with. But anyway, so the point is that being treifa alludes to being out there in the field, which is an allusion to our general circumstance of being in Golus, where we're out there in the field and we're reminded that this is not the real deal, and we want to come back home, Kenti Elanu, as we say in the Seder, and as we'll say this year, usually in the blessing at the end of the Haggadah, before we drink the second cup, we say that we'll eat in the temple from the Zvachim, the generic sacrifices, and from the Psachim, from the Pesach sacrifices. But this year, on the first Seder, which is Matzah Shabbos, there was no other sacrifices, because the other sacrifices being optional did not override Shabbos. Only the Pesach, which was mandatory, overrided Shabbos, and that's why if you pay attention to your Haggadah, you'll see that it says in parentheses, on Matzah Shabbos, you switch the order, and you say, sorry?
In the shaded box.
The shaded box, exactly. You say, make sure that on the second night you avoid the shade.